Hey guys, it's Josie with Queen My Pawn. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite strategical games, which was played by Alexander Alekhine. And here we go. This was played in London 1922 against Yates, another known master at the time. So there's going to be some ads popping up at the bottom, but let's ignore that. D4, knight of 6, C4, E6, knight of 3. I ended up playing this later in a tournament, and I had some pretty good results with it. But there is something that could pop up. C5 could pop up, and then D5, and then B5, which is called the Blumenfeld Gambit. Also played a lot by Alekhine. And obviously, after D takes E5, E6, F takes E6, C takes B5, the position is really not good after Black's D5 because of his preponderance of center pawns. So there was a game that was played. It was Taraksh against Alekhine in Bad Pistian, also in 1922. But I'll make a video about that later on. So let's go back to over here, analysis, and let's continue. So D5, okay, playing classical, knight C3. In the tournament, I played bishop G5, and I got a really good position. Similar to a Tory attack. I would highly recommend this before playing E3. But okay, Alekhine likes to play knight to C3. The problem with this is that, there are possibilities of bishop to B4, pinning your knight, and I really wanted to avoid that in the tournament since everyone knows that the Nimzo Indian nowadays is a good way to combat White's plan to play E4 soon. I ended up getting a really good position after bishop G5, and I talk about that in my video Game 2, Espinoza against Calderon. So let's continue. Bishop E7, bishop G5. Okay, this is basically almost like the same position that I got in the tournament, except my opponent didn't play D5, he played D6. The queen's Indian defense. Castles, E3. See, so now Alekhine has his bishop out of the pawn chain, so it's more active. And he doesn't have to worry about a bad bishop. Although it could be developed by B2 to B3 and bishop B2, I think that the point there is to conserve the bishop for later on in the endgame and to influence on E5 by knight to E5, and if some knight takes and pawn takes and the pawn supported. And possibly if that pawn stays there, it's really annoying for black. Or if the knight stays there, it's also really annoying for black. So it's a double-edged position. Knight B7. Possibly coming in with C5 at some point. But let's see what happens. Rook to C1. Developing just in case the files become open. He plays C6. But it's interesting to see what happens if C5. But the bishop on G5 is pinning that. So for example, C5, knight takes C5, then that pressure on D5 is really big. So pawn takes D5, or maybe even bishop takes F6, bishop takes F6, and then C takes D5. And black's got at least an isolated pawn, but then after E takes D5, knight takes D5. So black would have to play something like bishop takes C3, and if pawn takes C3 or rook takes C3, probably pawn takes C3, then E takes D5, and the pawn is still isolated. Pieces are coming off the board, and it's not good. So here's what I mean. C5, D takes C5, knight takes C5. This bishop is really annoying. Bishop takes F6, bishop takes F6, pawn takes D5. Black's about to lose a pawn unless he gives up the bishop pair. Pawn takes C3, pawn takes C3, and now E takes D5. And here, I can simply block the pawn with something like knight to D4 at some point. I don't even have to do it right now. I could simply play bishop e2, castle, and develop. And of course, I have an isolated pawn myself. I have it's an interesting position to analyze here, but I think white has the better prospects. We have a d4 square that we can move all of our pieces to, the queen and the rook. Anyways, I don't want to get too off topic here, but it's an interesting position to analyze. So let's close this now. So black shouldn't open up the game too early yet. He still needs to develop some more pieces. So he plays c6, reasonably so. He's probably going to play queen to a5 next, the Cambridge Springs variation. Okay, so queen to c2, but decides to go with rook to e8. Bishop to d3, pawn takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight to d5. This is interesting because black could have played b5 here, but that would have weakened the c6 pawn. And look at the pressure with the rook and the queen. It doesn't look favorable. For example, b5, bishop to d3, c5, but now the pawn on b5 was hanging, so it would be recommendable to have a6 there before doing such a thing. Instead, Yates determines to play another strategy. He wants to exchange that bishop. So in this position, it's interesting to analyze that black has a really inactive bishop on c8. It's just blocked in by everything. Black's knights are valuable. Black has an active bishop. So I think white should trade that active bishop that black has on e7 and then do bishop takes knight. And that's not what happened, but instead it was knight to e4, protecting the bishop on g5. So f5 now. Now, actually, that's really interesting what Alekhine just did. He moved knight to e4. So actually, I think this is a stronger move now that I think about it. This is way stronger because you're invoking the opponent to make a weakness. You know what I mean? This is just fine for white, surely, but why not go for more? And you're not even losing anything. Like if knight to b4, queen to b1, or if knight to b6, bishop to b3, or bishop to d3, which looks better actually. I think it's better. Bishop to d3 is better. So yeah, Alekhine did a superior move by moving knight to e4. Very good. So now f5, and now he trades the bishop. And then queen takes, and then knight to d2. And that, the knights are going to e5 and f3. So it's looking good. Interestingly, bishop takes didn't happen just yet. Maybe something else is planned. Let's see what happens. b5. Okay, another weakness. Look at that. Now the bishop takes. That's amazing. Alekhine is invoking weaknesses before he exchanges. That's just amazing. So bishop takes c5, c takes c5, and now castles. And now black has a lot of weaknesses. The bishop is blocked in. a5 to prevent b4 at some point. Obviously not now because of the queen. So black is getting some queenside space, surely. In the close center, that's fine. White's looking for an outpost on c5. So a4, knight to c5. Knight takes, queen takes. Queen takes. If the queen moves somewhere like to f7, then maybe just queen takes pawn. So maybe queen to b7, but then knight to e5, and black starts to become compressed, to say the least. Or maybe even after queen to b7 to prevent b4, I would play something like a3, because the knight to e5 can wait. So queen takes, rook takes, and look at that. We have the c file, beautiful. b4, rook a to c1, obviously. I mean, rook f c1. Bishop to a6, he activates the bishop, but what's it doing? It's not attacking anything. It's like a sniper that's pointing at basically nothing. A knight to e5, so f4 has to be coming at some point, or even f3. We're gonna see what happens. Now, it's either between f4 or f3, guys. f4 would be good if we were still in the middle game, because then a rook can go to f3. Actually, my teacher Alejandro Moreno pointed that out. But f3 is better for the endgame, because you can actually push your pawn to e4, and it stays more mobile. So f3 was played. By the way, of course, f4, f3 to activate the king, right? So f3, b3, a3, keeping everything closed. The knight on e5 is preventing the bishop from going to c4, chopping off the communication between the rooks. So that's a really good night, or is it a good morning? Just kidding. So h6, king to f2, king to h7, and now it's really becoming clear that white has a decisive advantage after something like h4, h5, and knight to g6, and with the knight on g6, that's protected by a pawn on h5. You're thinking of hook mates with rook to h8 at some point. That pawn on g7 is fixed. It's super weak. So Alekhine correctly plays h4. Also, another hidden reason behind this move. White wants to move his king to f4 so that he has a better king position. Maybe it can invade through e5 as well. There's no way that the king can be checked here. So this needs to be played in order to prevent g5, possibly checkmating the king as well at some point, or just checking the king. g5 wouldn't work here because of maybe rook to c7, and well, I haven't really analyzed it too deeply, but it's a check, and that's the first thing that I consider. But I won't spend too much time on the calculation, because I'm more concerned about the positional qualities of the game. But you know, it's a done deal after g5. I mean, we can let the engine tell us. Maybe you want to think for yourself and not look at the engine. So on rook f8, king to g3, the king is becoming activated. Black has nothing better to do than wait, so rook to b8. Now rook to c7, bishop to b5. If rook to b7, maybe just rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, and then rook to c7, and it's going to be over again. So bishop to b5, he can't trade another rook. I mean, there's no domination. By the way, there's an interesting detail here. If rook to c8, I didn't mention this before, but I could have mentioned that maybe over a long time ago, like a very long time ago. Here, if rook to c8, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, bishop takes, and then knight to c6, threatening b4 and e7, forking the bishop and the king, like so. And the knight's going to have to go win something in the end. But could it be played here? Well, I don't think the endgame would be too favorable. If everything is exchanged and the bishop ends up on c8, the bishop only has c4 to go to. Obviously, we wouldn't do knight takes c4 because he could do a pawn sacrifice with something like c3, pawn takes c3, and then b2. But the knight has a lot of places to go to, and our king can go there, and then the knight can just go somewhere else. It's too bad. And the bishop is just super blocked, so he doesn't want to exchange. So let's go back to the position. After bishop to b5, he played rook 1 to c5, touching the bishop. Bishop to a6, and now rook 5 to c6, attacking the pawn. Rook to e8, and now king to f4. King to g8, h5. Bishop to f1, and the pawn simply moves up to g3. See, if that pawn on h5 wasn't there, then g5 would be checkmate. Bishop to a6, rook to f7, king to h7, rook 6 to c7, a natural move, rook to g8. And now Alekhine knows that if he had a knight on f6, he could win a an exchange and probably the game. So he does so by moving knight to d7, king to h8, but knight to f6 anyways, because if the knight gets taken, then rook to h8 is checkmate, and now rook to f8. And here is a famous combination. So see if you can find it before I continue. You should try to pause the video now. Okay, so hopefully if you've paused the video. Now we're gonna see what exactly happens. The best move, obviously, is gonna be rook takes g7. It's forcing the rook to take on f6. Then we have a really good move here, and it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. King to e5. The rook is trapped. If the rook goes back to f8, it's a blind swine mate with rook h8 and rook c to g8, like so. Right here. Amazing. And that's all she wrote. So in the end, white simply resigns. I mean, black simply resigns after this move. Well, or not. He resigned after that move. So that was really beautiful. So that's one of my favorite games. We took advantage of the bad bishop. We made sure that we gave up our bishop because knights are better in close positions. And that's a good example. And that's all I have to say. If you liked this video, make sure to click the like button, subscribe to my content, and I'll see you on the next one.